Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's time in the Czech capital saw some serious developments. Pashinyan had his first meeting with Erdogan, another meeting was held with Aliyev, and an agreement was struck on an EU civilian mission to the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. To discuss this all, I am joined by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian. Eric, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, Pashinyan participated in this European Political Community Summit in Prague. How did you think he fared? Did he hold his own, or was he out of his depths?
I don't know. Well, I'm not sure how he was out of his depths because I'm not privy to their conversations, but he looked very bad. The perceptions of it were quite poor, frankly. I always have the standard in which when you see any kind of a meeting like this, you turn off the volume and just watch the body language. And it was very clear he was uncomfortable. It was very clear he was unhappy, as his enemies are slapping each other in the back and they're very happy. So it was actually, the spectacle of it was quite weak. And I think the fact that he was there, being the week that he was there, i.e. the week that the video of the execution of POWs is coming out, was short, tone deaf, and I think he didn't look like he fits the part. And at the Prague summit, all the EU member state countries were there, along with many other countries. Straight after the summit, Pashinyan headed to St. Petersburg to participate in another summit, but this time with countries in the Russian sphere of influence. What were your impressions of Pashinyan's back-to-back, east-to-west trip, and what do you think were the broader implications for Armenia here? Well, we don't know too much about St. Petersburg, to be honest with you. Obviously, the more important one was the Prague one. And, you know, we see the statement that came out that the countries recognize each other's borders. You know, people are upset about that, but people are actually upset about the wrong thing. That has never been an issue. Every government in this country since 1991 has actually recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and their borders. And in fact, they have done to us. Now they're violating it, but this has been the case for 31 years. Armenia's position has always been that Armenia has no territorial ambitions on Azerbaijan, but that Azerbaijan needs to deal with the Armenians of Karabakh and allow them their right to self-determination, independence, whatever, and or come up with some settlement with them. It was always, you need to deal with those people, but we don't, Armenia proper itself has no ambitions on Azeri territories. If people are upset about that's not what they should be upset about, is because that's not a controversial thing. It hasn't been a controversial thing. The controversial thing is you go through this entire community meetings and there's not a single word of Artsakh. There's not a single word about the rights of people in Artsakh. You know, the Europeans have sort of conned us. They got us started saying, you know, stop talking about sovereignty, stop talking about self-determination. Let's move this into a human rights issue. And now that we made that concession, now it's no longer a human rights issue, and there's no mention of it. While at the same time, post this event, essentially, Aliyev holds a press conference saying, these are my people. No one has a right to interfere in this process. Now, we know that's nonsense, is because everything we know about this and what's going on in the background, there's going to be direct negotiations between the Aliyev regime and the Artsakh Republic. We know that's in the works from different sources. So what he's saying is not necessarily true. But the optics of this is what people are mad about, the wrong thing. What people should be upset about is that Artsakh is not at the center of solving this crisis, because frankly, you cannot solve this crisis. You cannot have a fair settlement here without having a fair settlement in Artsakh. Because the border issues between the countries and the continued aggressions by the Aliyev regime or invasion of Armenian territory is to force essentially the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. So the Artsakh issue, you cannot, this is this European notion of sidestepping it. You cannot sidestep it. It has to be the center of everything that's discussed.
And another historic moment, of course, was Pashinyan's first tete-a-tete meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They had previously only had one phone call. What was this all about, in your opinion? What do you think of these two men finally meeting face-to-face?
Utterly irrelevant. And from Pashinyan's point of view, just politically tone-deaf and disastrous for his own purposes. First of all, almost every Armenian leader has met with Turkish leaders. Serge Sarkisian met with Erdogan. Levon was in Istanbul meeting with Turkish leaders. I'm not sure if Kocharian met. I don't recall that, but maybe he did. So having the leader of Armenia meet the leader of Turkey is not that monumental. Bottom line is, it's not going to change anything. We've been having this negotiations for 6 months. There's an agreement to open the border to third-party persons. The border hasn't opened. So this is all that he ended up doing, is legitimizing and making Erdogan look like a good guy in the eyes of Europeans and Americans as he's trying to establish relations with Armenia, even though that is entirely farcical and entirely based on lies. And politically, for him to be meeting with Erdogan in a week in which videos out with Turkish, Aliyev's troops that are trained by Turkish special forces executing Armenian POWs, is so politically tone deaf, I can't even put it to words.
And Pashinyan, Aliyev, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the European Council President Charles Michel also had a four-way meeting in Prague. An agreement was struck to send a civilian EU mission to the Armenia-Azerbaijan border following the mid-September deadly attack by Azerbaijan. Is this good news?
It's irrelevant. First of all, this is time limited to 2 months, in the 2 months of winter, where everyone knows fighting in these areas stops or becomes far less likely when you can't move, you can't do anything, and it's snow everywhere. So they're here for Christmas. It's not going to solve anything. So they're here at a time, exactly at a time where things are least likely to happen, where the aggressions are least likely to happen, at least in the areas that they're going to be at. Second of all, given that the EU's role has been to essentially legitimize every Azeri aggression, every Aliyev aggression, or make excuses for it, what do you think these people are going to do? Second of all, as a matter of principle, what this does, this again creates a sort of a logistical both-sidism. This is not a problem with both sides encroaching on each other's territories. There's one aggressor and another country that's being attacked. So when you have a setup like this, you're essentially creating equity between the victim and the attacker. And this is their purpose. So this is an entirely worthless thing, and we should not give it any value.
I want to ask also about Azerbaijan. Many in Armenia, some in Armenia, see hope being kindled when these agreements are struck. But we've seen agreements struck in the past. In Azerbaijan, Aliyev orders further aggressive actions against Armenia. In all likelihood, can we expect the same this time? Yes,
any agreement signed means nothing. Listen, the two things that happened on after the 13th attack. Politically, the September 13th attack was actually more relevant than the 44-day war, because it did two things. One, it smashed the Russian stranglehold on the Armenian political imagination or defense imagination, opened up the road for the United States, which has been quite significant. And second of all, convinced everyone, including this government, that peace is not an option, no matter what they say. And the proof of it is very clear. This, last week they raised military spending by 46%. If you think peace is on the horizon, you don't raise defense spending by 46%. So Pashinyan might speak about peace, but I think at this point, even he doesn't believe it. It's just he just backed himself into a corner. Peace does not serve the interest of the Aliyev regime. It does not. So no matter what the world wants, any kind of a negotiated peaceful settlement, even for a period of time, contradicts regime interests. And regime interests in the long run will override other calculations. In fact, you can take the man at his word. In one of the Aliyev watches that we did, in one of the videos, he says the most important thing we did is to ignore all international negotiations and international actors. What would make anyone believe that, okay, you sign a peace agreement? This is the big fallacy of the peace camp in Armenia. They think that if you make the concessions, you sign something, that's the end of it. Well, what if you sign the end of it? What if you sign this and they don't leave the occupied territories? What if you sign it and they continue aggressions in other places? What if you sign it and they don't free the POWs? The truth of the matter is anything that is signed, unless it comes with, great international pressure or presence, it's worth as much as the pen that's used to sign that agreement, which is nothing.
So it seems, though, that the EU, the Europeans, have been observing the Americans and the Russians trying to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and are now trying to offer their own vision for how things should be. What do you think of the European vision compared to Russia and America? And can you describe the three policy approaches of these three major powers?
Obviously, we're speaking from a blind spot because we're not privy to sit closed doors. So we can only guess, reading between the lines. The Russian interest is simple. This issue should never be solved. This allows us to have a stranglehold on the political systems of two countries that are important to us, and that we will never leave. And because this is not solved, we won't leave. Now, there's actually areas of that actually align with our interests, because we actually wanted to freeze the current status quo, given the balance of forces, the imbalance of forces. That's the Russian game plan. So what's one of the things is all these discussions that are going on by these outside parties, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is Russia. Because you can have all these agreements and they can say no, or we're sitting here, or we're going to do our own agreement, or we're not going to leave. So at the end of the day, you have to talk to Russia because they're the peacekeepers on the ground. And at this point, Artsakh is as much of a Russian problem as it is an Armenian problem. And in fact, it's the nicest, prettiest, biggest Russian base in the world, if you really want to know the truth at this point, practically. So the Russians is for this scenario to be drawn out, and that since the Western interest is to solve this issue and shove them out, their interest is to make sure that this issue is not solved and they get to stay. Now, at some point, they might not have the power given what's going on in the world, but that's their primary interest. The European Union's position is the closest one to the Aliyev position. What the European Union, the ideal situation for them is an ethnically cleansed Artsakh in which everybody moves to their own countries from their perception. And the issue is settled. You don't need the Russians, and they leave. And they're essentially, morally blind in this approach. Because that will not bring peace. An ethnically cleansed Artsakh means 2 more generations of war. Because an ethnically cleansed Artsakh will make it the primary mission of the entire political establishment in this country is to reverse that humiliation. So that needs to be avoided at all cost for everyone's purposes, including Aliyev's people. So the European Union position is to have ethnic cleansing without the ugly scenes. And what's my proof of this is the fact that no European official, as an EU official, I'm not talking about France, has ever made the statement that the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians of Artsakh is not acceptable. There's no such thing. So here you have, in this European continent in which the EU will fight for the rights of this group, that group, they are not willing to say that the Aliyev regime does not have the right to ethnically cleanse the Armenians of Artsakh. It is key for us to make the EU as a negotiating body be the second or third option. They should not be leading it. They are not favorable to us, and certainly not to the people of Artsakh. So that's their position. The problem for them is that their in-house noble savage keeps screwing up their plans. Instead of Aliyev not doing anything, he does things like the September 13th invasion, which managed to upend the entire political, balance of power here, bring in the Americans, convince everyone in Armenia that peace is a joke, and marginalize the Europeans in the process, and upset their plans. There's actually a very particular reason why, for example, the European Union never denounces any atrocities by the Aliyev regime. It's because they need to have moral equivalency between the two parts. And if one state is genocidal and is intent on ethnic cleansing or genocide, and you want them to actually achieve their goals, you cannot call them out. Because if you call them out, then you cannot hold that position. There's a reason Toivu Klar will excuse the sexual assault of a dead Armenian soldier, a woman, a female soldier, because he has to. There's a reason that he will make excuses for the execution of 7 POWs and make up two-sided time comments. So we need to understand who these people are, where they come from. They need to be marginalized behind the other parties because the other parties are far more favorable to us. As far as the United States, at this point, they're by far the best interlocutor. If for no other reason is that they actually have power. The Europeans have influence, the Americans have power. They can make people say yes when they want to say no. So I think anything that involves U.S. mediation, anything that involves U.S. influence, especially if it leads to some kind of a Dayton-type summit in which everybody's in the room and you're going to hammer out some agreement, that's what matters. I think the United States involvement, the more it's maximalized, the better in our interest.
And finally, Eric, in all these talks, all these things we're talking about, what does Azerbaijan have going for it, and what does Armenia have going for it?
What Azerbaijan is going for it is what I call morally degenerate centrism. There's this concept in international diplomacy or law in which all sides, there's gray areas and everything, and that all sides are equal, which is the standard European position on many things. Now that's true 90% of the time. And frankly, it might have been true in this conflict prior to the end of the war, prior to November 9th of 2020. However, that's no longer true. The math here is simple. You have a regime that's interested in ethnic cleansing, enforced by genocide. Are you for them? Or are you not for that? It's as simple as that. And if you're not for that, what's your scenario in preventing it? Frankly, that's the only conversation worth having at this point. There's no other conversation. Everything else is a distraction. So that's what Azerbaijan's got going for it. This notion that there's gray areas, or is that, there needs to be, that there's equivalency, that there's moral equivalency between these two sides, and it's something we need to attack and shatter. What the best thing that Armenia has going for it is Ilhan Aliyev. Let's just give a perfect example. Everything was going in his favor prior to September 13th. He does this foolish attack. Yes, they move up a couple of miles here or there. But in return, what you get is you shattered any peace camp in Armenia. You've essentially started the rearming of this country finally seriously. And far more devastatingly, you brought the most important power in the world as an interlocutor when the other interlocutors are actually far more favorable to you. Because he can tell a lot of the world to go to hell. He has a hard time telling the United States to go to hell. So the best diplomat that we have, the best negotiator for our purposes, is actually Ilhan Aliyev. And what is critical for us is to sort of systematically bring out what I call the Milosevicization of Aliyev, to show him for what he is, for his gangster statements, to lay him out for his, genocidal plans. So he's the best thing going for us, far more so than our political leadership or our diplomats.
Well, Eric, as always, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for following us on CivilNet.